So our focal point this morning is the central precept of the Christian faith is that sin has estranged us from the holy Creator, and God went through extreme measures to reconcile us to himself. He was prodigal in his approach. And for those of you who may not know, prodigal means extravagant or a spendthrift. They don't spare any expense. That's why the prodigal son took all of his inheritance and blew it in a matter of a couple weeks, and then he was destitute and poor. But what a lot of people don't know about the story of the prodigal son is that it illustrates the prodigal love of the father towards the son. And God was prodigal towards us. He spared no expense. So he was prodigal in his approach, and he spared no expense to purchase our freedom. We must remember that we are deserving of God's wrath, but when we believe in him, he justifies and sanctifies us. Praise God for that, because we are made free in the love of Christ. A lot of people have this weird notion about God that he owes you something. Like every morning you wake up, you're the center of his creation. He worships you instead of you worshiping him. He lavishly puts things and blessings upon you. But the reality of it is that God doesn't owe us anything, but yet he gave us everything. We are so undeserving of his mercy, but he freely gives it because he created us to be his people. So let's go ahead and read Romans 1, 18 through 20. You could follow along on the screen if you don't have your Bibles this morning. And it says this: "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse." And the word men there is cosmos in Greek, meaning every human creature. Men, women, children, babies, all of mankind, assumed under the title cosmos. All of the earth is under the curse of the sin. This includes everybody. It doesn't matter if you're a Jew, a Gentile, a pagan. Every human being who has ever drawn breath into their lungs and expelled it out of their mouth is under the curse of sin. So God has made a world full of justice. One of the essential attributes of God is justice. It's necessary to his nature. And wherever you have justice, you have judgment. And whenever there is judgment, there is wrath. Just look at our penal system in the United States of America. If you break the law, you go before the judge. He judges you for your wrongdoing and then administers a sentence towards you, and there is the wrath of society behind his judgment. Whatever that might be: murder, theft, slander, extortion, money laundering, tax evasion, rape. You receive the wrath meted out by society through the judge. It's no different with a holy God. So in this portion of Scripture, the Apostle Paul begins his lengthy treatise of the first part of the first movement, explaining that both Gentiles and Jews, the shut-outs and the chosen, stand on one side of a wide gulf from God, with a canyon of sin separating us from him. Because of God's essential quality, the attribute of justice, we cannot be with God until the chasm of sin is bridged. You can't stand before a holy God without being justified and sanctified through Christ. God, since his central attribute is goodness and justice, you can't stand before him a sinful human being. The book of Isaiah in the 6th chapter records a very interesting and powerful testimony of Isaiah when he was commissioned to be a prophet. He was taken up to what seemed to be like heaven to him. He was in a courtroom full of angels. He saw God sitting on his throne, and he said, "Woe is me! I am a man of unclean lips." So one of the angels grabbed a coal off the altar with some tongs, flew down to him, touched his lips, and purified them with fire so he could stand in the courtroom of God, the God of all justice. As a wicked, sinful human being, you can't stand before a holy God without being purified by the fire of the gospel of Jesus Christ. In verse 16, Paul tells us that the central focus of all life's yearning and groaning is the realization of the gospel of Jesus Christ in our lives. Now here in verses 18 through 20, Paul explains what the limitation of our own capacity to pull ourselves out is and how sin is a self-defeating obstacle for us. However, Paul also says that God has sufficiently revealed himself to us so that we are without excuse. In the Christian conception of God, you are not able to pull yourself up into righteousness, into holiness on your own. The book of Ephesians tells us that salvation is by faith through grace. It is a gift of God and not of works, so that no man can boast. No matter how many good deeds you do in life, it will never put you in right standing with God if you don't bow your knee to him and claim him in your life. It never will happen. And there's a very popular mainstream movement in the Christian world in 21st century America that we don't ever talk about judgment or wrath or the anger of God. We completely eschew that because it might offend somebody's sensibilities, it might upset them, it might make them feel bad about themselves. But the reality of it is if we don't warn people and tell them, your house is on fire, get out, they're going to perish. You would never see your neighbor's house on fire knowing that your neighbor and his wife and his children are in the house and you don't do anything to warn them about it, to tell them to get out of there. Your house is going to burn down. If you do the same, if you were to do that spiritually, you're morally culpable for their death, for their spiritual death. And so we warn people. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father but by him. There is only one name given under heaven by which you can be saved. That is the life ring we are throwing out into the world. I remember hearing Penn Teller. He's a famous atheist. You guys know him from Penn and Gillette, the Las Vegas magic show. I heard him on a podcast one time say that he's actually disappointed when he talks to a Christian person and they don't try to present to him the gospel, because if it's that important for you to change your life completely for, why wouldn't you think it's important for me too? And that's the reality of the situation. If we believe we hold life and truth and hope and peace and we don't offer it to the world, we're morally culpable for somebody else's life. That's like the Good Samaritan laws. If you see somebody dying on the street and you just pass them by, you don't help them, you don't offer aid, you're morally culpable for their death. And so you're morally culpable for the spiritual death of other people too. So the wrath of God is central to the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ because one of the main attributes of who God is his justice. Without justice, there is no reconciliation for wrongdoing. And justice is important because all of the wrongs of life are satisfied before a holy God. There have been many people say that, Pastor Don, I can't pull myself to believing in your God because too many bad things happen in the world. And it's completely gratuitous and nonsensical, and it's such a gigantic amount of pain and suffering. How could your God exist at the same time as all this suffering? One thing about the Christian faith is it says that God didn't stay an absentee landlord up in heaven on his ivory tower. He entered into human suffering too, and he participated in our life, and he participated in our death, and he won the victory for us. So, God is a just God. And all of the sin of the world, there are people who have lived and who are living now that will never receive justice in this life. They won't. They're raped or they're murdered, and their perpetrators get away with it, and they have no justice. But Christians believe that on that day, not too long from now, we will all be standing before a holy God, giving account for our lives, and those people who have committed crime in this life that never received punishment in this life will receive it in the next. That's justice, and that's why it's important. So the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. I remember hearing an interesting quote not too long ago by Immanuel Kant, and he said, "There are two things that fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the more and the steadily we reflect upon them. And those two things are the starry skies above us and the moral law within us." You see, God has written eternity on your heart, and more than that, He has written His moral law on your heart. Everybody knows that lying is wrong, that stealing is wrong, that murder is wrong, that rape is wrong, because God has written that on your heart. And there isn't a single culture across the globe who believes that murdering somebody is justified or okay. Just kind of as an aside, there's a lot of people who say, well, Pastor Don, doesn't that violate the Ten Commandments? Thou shalt not kill. The Hebrew word there, kill, actually means murder. Sometimes killing is justified, but murder never is. So the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. You see, there is something in nerdy theological terms that's called the noetic effects of sin. The more you sin, the more you allow sin to take hold in your life, to root itself in your heart, you become more susceptible to committing more and more sin. And when you commit more and more sin, you fog over the lenses, your spiritual lenses, so you can't see God's morality the way He intended you to. That's the noetic effects of sin. So the more you sin, the more you want to sin, and the more you want to sin, and the more you do sin, separates you further from a holy God. And so, when we suppress the truth by our wickedness, we become wicked, corrupt people. Now, a few things about the wrath of God that we need to talk about this morning, and you probably should take notes. This is important. We have some deep plowing to do today. And that's this: in both Hebrew and Greek, justice and righteousness are synonymous. There's not two different words for those two terms like there is in English. Justice and righteousness are the exact same word in Hebrew and Greek. In English, we say justice and righteousness, and we think that there's a difference with them biblically, and there isn't. Justification and sanctification are two different words too. Some people get those things confused. Justification is the process, is the act of you being made right with God in the instant of your salvation. When you ask Jesus into your heart, you are justified. That means God removes the sin barrier from your life. You cross over the chasm of sin, and you're reunited with the Holy God. That's justification. Sanctification is completely different. Sanctification is the process of you becoming more and more like Jesus every day. Sanctification is discipleship. The word righteousness occurs 24 times in the first 3 chapters of the book of Romans. So for the Apostle Paul, it's a very important concept. The term righteousness means being made right with God. You're put back into an upright standing before God. It literally means that in the Greek. You're put back up on your feet and you're standing before a holy God instead of lying down prostrate, wallowing in your sin. God's justifying activity is based on the act of the cross through the death of Jesus as satisfaction for a debt of sin. One thing that you'll notice, and we'll try to do this quickly, I don't want to take too much time belaboring the point, but if you look at the Jewish sacrificial system during Passover and Yom Kippur, there was a time when you had to present a sacrifice for the sins of your life, and it was a blood offering made at the altar of God. Jesus, in the Gospels, we hear that he became the ultimate sacrifice for human sin. On the moment he cried out, "It is finished," on the cross, the veil was torn in the temple, and there was no longer a separation between the outer court and the inner court of the temple of God in Jerusalem. It was torn in half. God's righteousness is for anyone who believes. Doesn't matter your cultural background, your socioeconomic status. It doesn't matter the past sins of your life. God's righteousness is for anyone who believes. Romans 10:9 says that if you believe that Jesus Christ is Lord and that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. The second thief hanging on the cross next to Jesus, he was a horrible, wretched, wicked man, tells Jesus, "Jesus, Jesus, will you remember me in paradise?" And Jesus says, "I tell you that on this very day you will be with me in paradise." God's righteousness is for anyone. Paul describes the depth and breadth of the sin problem of humankind, every human being. It permeates every area, every crack, every nook, every cranny of human life is covered with sin. And it's interesting just to ask your 2-year-old toddler who has stolen cookies out of the cookie jar if he did something wrong, and he will admit it was wrong. "Johnny, don't take any cookies out of the cookie jar. I'm going into the kitchen. I'll come right back." Lid of the cookie jar's off. Cookie crumbs all over the kitchen table. "Johnny, did you eat some cookies?" He knows it's wrong. Faith is the only means of justification before God. Salvation is by grace through faith. Nothing else is required. No works, no merit, no paying of penance. None of it. Faith by grace. That's it. The thief on the cross is the greatest example of that. So we now see the first part of the first movement. Paul is laying out the wrath of God and the justice and righteousness of God for a sinful people. God's wrath falls on all humans who do not follow God's truth as revealed by Him. You know, a lot of people have this weird concept of God that God conforms His will to you. Whatever your pleasures are, whatever your philosophy is, God becomes that. You put God in your box and you carry Him around with you. And if it just so happens to fit the situation, you pull Him out and say, "Ha! God." God doesn't serve you. You serve God. And so we conform our will to Him. We conform our life to Him. We conform our attitude to Him. We conform our behavior to Him. And we are His people. He doesn't worship you. You worship Him. God's wrath is not emotional rage, but steadfast in absolute opposition to wrong and evil. God's wrath is not emotional. God's wrath is justice, righting all the wrongs in life. And I remember Ravi Zacharias said one time that sometimes God writes straight with crooked lines. Justice is an essential attribute of God's characteristic. Without justice, He would not be a loving God, because loving gods make sure that they right all the wrongs of life. God always acts in accordance with what is right and is Himself the standard of what is right. God always speaks and acts what is right. Sin and wrongdoing require punishment, not reward. You don't reward your child for bad behavior, you reward them for good behavior. I see that you worked hard this semester, you studied, you applied yourself. Let's go ahead and go out to eat at your favorite restaurant. You don't say that of your child who skips school every day, who's belligerent, who's a truant, who's a delinquent. Hey, I know you just got arrested today. Let's go ahead and go out to eat dinner together. Sin and wrongdoing require punishment, not reward. The first movement of Romans is Paul explaining God's demonstration of His righteousness. Can you believe that this morning? God demonstrates His righteousness. And it's interesting because Paul carries on, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. I didn't know that was wrong. I didn't know that stealing my neighbor's car was wrong. I thought it would be okay to borrow it for a few days. They wouldn't mind. You knew it was wrong. You know what's wrong when you lie to get ahead in life? You know what's wrong when you fudge the numbers on your tax return? You know what's wrong when you slip something into your pocket at the supermarket? There are consequences for your behavior because God has revealed it to you. Like I said, He's written His moral law in your heart. And even more than that, that's one example. The Bible tells us that the heavens declare the handiwork of God. And this is an interesting point that I want to get into now. We're going to try to do this quickly. We're already running a little bit behind today. But in life, no matter where you are in life, there's beauty all around you, and it's undeniable. The majestically painted skies of a sunrise or a sunset, the beautiful landscaped vistas of mountains, high desert prairies. One of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen in my life was I was fishing at the Twin Lost Lakes in the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming. It was a torrential downpour, thunder, lightning, 15 minutes of the worst weather I had ever seen on top of a mountain. The sun broke through the mountain, and on the east side of the lakes, it was sheer cliffs for as far as you can see. When the sun broke back through the clouds, it hit the face of the cliff that had just been wet by rain, and it looked like golden majesty. It was the most remarkable thing I'd ever seen. The thing that people don't understand is that if you believe in naturalism, which is a consequence of atheism, beauty is unaccounted for on that worldview because beauty has no evolutionary survival value. If you're being chased by a beast, why would you stop to see the beauty of a flower springing up in the middle of a mud hole? You wouldn't. Beauty confers no survival value on you, but yet you perceive it and you notice it every single day. Every time I drive across the bridge going to the store in Astoria and come back, I am marveled by the beauty of the landscape of the Columbia River. And this beauty is all around us, and God has created it for our pleasure, and we notice it, and it moves us deeply. Have you ever heard the musical orchestral piece Adagio for Strings? And the choral version of that, Agnus Dei by Barber? One of the most beautifully moving pieces I've ever heard in my life. And when you hear it, you get a sense of longing in your heart that there has to be something more in life than just what we see around us, all the horror, all the misery, all the pain, all the destruction, all the negative news, all of the backbiting, all of the infighting. There has to be more to life than that. You sit down and you hear Adagio for Strings and you say, "Ha! There is a God." And the heavens declare the glory and masterpiece of God. As I said, Immanuel Kant said that there are two things that fill the mind with There are two things that fill the mind with ever-increasing admiration and awe: the moral law within us and the starry skies above us. And when you look at the universe, you see God's handiwork. And we'll briefly go through some scientific facts. If this goes over your head, don't mind. It went over mine for a long time. But I'll try to articulate it as best as possible. We live in the Milky Way galaxy on the third planet in our solar system. And our planet just happens to be 49.6 million miles away from the sun. If it was any closer, it would be uninhabitable for life. Any further, it would be uninhabitable for life. The moon is about 500,000 miles from the Earth, and if it was any closer, it would throw off the tidal interchanges of our ocean, and the tide would run up onto the landmass, wipe everything out. If it was too far away, our tidal systems would be too weak, and our ocean would grow stagnant and die. Just by the placement of our galaxy in the universe, it's a thing called the Kuiper. It's called the livable zone of our universe. It's a very, very small section of the universe that's only habitable for life, and our galaxy happens to be there. If you look at all the laws of nature, there's several of them, like Newton's law of gravity, the gravitational weak force, the gravitational strong force, the nuclear weak force, the nuclear strong force, Planck's constant, and all those nerdy scientific things. The amazing thing about those constants and quantities is that they have to be there, and they have to be precisely as they are in order for life to exist. And if, let's say we had a panel of dials, let's say we were a transcendent being and we had a panel of dials. This one's Planck's constant, this one's Newton's law of gravity, this one's the nuclear strong force, this one's the nuclear weak force. If you move those dials 1 micromillimeter, just one of the dials, life on Earth is completely wiped out. And all of these dials, there's dozens of them, are precisely set to where they need to be in order for life to exist on this Earth. Is it mere coincidence? I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. I just don't. Because if you move one of those dials 1 micromillimeter, all of life, it stops existing. And every single one of those dials are precisely tuned so that life can exist on this earth. Tell me there isn't a God. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. You want to hear a powerful testimony to this? The 3 greatest Greek philosophers, the triumvirate of Greek philosophy, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, they were able to logically deduce that there is only one God. There could only be one God. They called him the prime mover or the uncaused cause. Socrates was forced to drink hemlock and commit suicide because he was corrupting the minds of kids, telling them that there was only one God. You don't need to believe in the pantheon of the Greek gods. There's only one. And you see, they had no influence from Jewish culture, no influence from monotheistic religions. They logically deduced that from what they saw in nature. There could only be one God. Now, we're not as smart as Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, but God has made it abundantly clear. I call them signposts of transcendence. They're little things that we notice on the road of life. There has to be a God. There has to be something more than this. This can't be all there is. There's an ultimate higher reality. Many people call that by something different, by a God of any other name. But when you look deeply at the facts, it points you towards the God of Judeo-Christianity, because when you really study comparative religions, there is no other room for any other God. There just isn't. So God has made himself plainly known. And nerdy theological circles, there's a thing called Revelation. Have you heard of that? I'm not talking about the last book of the New Testament. That's actually called the Apocalypse of John, what Latinized people called the Revelation. Revelation in theological terms is somebody communicating one thing to one person by, could be any other mean, a letter, a phone call. When you reveal something to somebody, you're telling them something that they didn't already know. And in nerdy theological circles, there's something called general revelation and special revelation. And this is important that we understand the distinction, because there is a difference. General revelation is you perceiving God in nature. General revelation is you walking on the beach during the sunset, and you're struck and you're gobsmacked by the beauty of everything that's all around you. That's God saying, I'm here, I care, isn't this beautiful? And I painted that just for you. That's general revelation. Special revelation is God speaking directly to a handful of men to compose this book. All of the truth of God, all of His attributes, all of the wisdom of God is contained in these pages. Now, I'm not saying that the NIV is God's revealed word, or the ESV, or the KJV, or any of the other hundreds of thousands of translations of the original manuscripts of Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic. Those are divinely inspired. Those are the revelation of God. But God has spoken to us more specifically through the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus is God's Son, the second person of the Trinity. And He had revealed some pretty amazing things to us about who God is. So there's general revelation, what we can see in nature, our logical deductions, the beauty, the splendor, the awe, the goodness. And I just want to add this in there. If you believe that the problem of evil is a defeater to God, then you have to deal with the problem of good. Because there's more good than there is evil on an overwhelming scale. So our final thought this morning is because God is a God of justice, He cannot tolerate sin, evil, wickedness, and disobedience to His creative order. We are deserving of wrath. That is what is merited to us. However, God longs to reconcile us and justify us before His justice and wrath through His mercy and love. Bad cannot go unpunished. God would not be an all-loving, all-benevolent God if He let wickedness and injustices of the world go without punishment. Even most rational human parents who deeply love their children do not let their bad behavior go without correction. It is not loving to let your children do whatever they want at the detriment to their health, the family's health, or the cohesion of your unit. So God dispenses His wrath on those deserving it. God has revealed His nature and essential attributes to us, both through general and special revelation. He has written eternity on our hearts. He has ingrained in us His moral code that what repulses most people from complete human depravity. Because of God's moral law, we can see human depravity for what it is. He has placed His thumbprints and signposts of transcendence that point to Him all over the highways of our lives. We are without excuse in denying Him as our Creator. Immanuel Kant said, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe. The more and steadily we reflect upon them, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. The question of God lies before us. How do you answer the question of God?"